It's a great pleasure for me to be with you today. As Debbie said, I've spoken at more than 190 UU churches around the country. I love UU churches. Otherwise, I wouldn't have spoken at so many, I guess. Anyway, I find that there's always a spirit of love and acceptance and appreciation of diversity and that sort of thing. And so it's just really a pleasure to be with you today. When I served the United Methodist Church in Dallas Center, Iowa, I became acquainted with the UU minister in Des Moines. And when she realized that I believed in Universalism, she invited me to attend a special service that they were going to be having. It was going to be in the small town of Mitchellville, which is just a few miles east of Des Moines. And it was to be in a church building that originally housed a Universalist congregation. There was not a congregation there anymore, but they had the tradition, that church in Des Moines had the tradition of having one service there each summer as a way of celebrating their Universalist heritage. So I was happy to accept her invitation to join them for that service, and I'll always remember as I walked up the walk in front of that church, over the door it read, Universalist Church, and I thought, I have arrived at home. Universalism has been really important to me for a long time. I really can't trace back where it all started, but it's been going on for a long time. And so that's why I wrote a book on the subject ultimately, and Darlene and I have traveled around the country, and I've spoken in 43 of the 50 states so far. My goal is to speak in all 50 states about the wonderful message of Universalism. Anyway, so it's important to me, obviously, or I wouldn't be traveling around speaking about Universalism. Today I'm going to be speaking on the history and the significance of the teaching of Universalism. It's sometimes referred to as universal salvation, so I'd like to offer a definition of salvation that's probably different from what you've heard from other sources. You're probably aware that at least among conservative Christians, the definition of salvation would be to accept Jesus as your personal Savior so you can go to heaven when you die. Well, I believe that's not a very adequate understanding of salvation because it doesn't necessarily involve any change or growth. And so a definition I've come up with for salvation is that it is to learn and grow either with or without divine influence so as to experience fullness of life in this life and beyond. And if you don't believe in the divine, or if you don't believe in life after death, then you can just leave those parts off the definition. And so to me, the most basic definition of salvation is to learn and grow so as to experience fullness of life. So in contrast to what a lot of people believe, I reject the idea that many people will suffer forever in hell. Instead, I believe that everyone will eventually experience fullness of life or salvation. And for certain individuals, if that doesn't take place in this lifetime, I believe it will take place sometime beyond. During the time of the early church, it was commonly taught in most of the religions of the day that the vast majority of people would spend eternity suffering in hell. But there was at least one exception to that in the organized religions, and that was Zoroastrianism. And that wonderful, they believed in Universalism. That faith was formed and developed in the area of Persia in the 5th and 6th centuries. Of course, Persia is where the current country of Iran is. And so they believed in Universalism. Also, in contrast to the conventional thinking of the day, it seems clear to me that Jesus did not teach eternal damnation, but he taught Universalism. I think that's evident from many passages in the Bible. In the environment, though, where the conventional thinking was that a lot of people would spend eternity suffering in hell, it was sometimes difficult to convince people otherwise. And so, while as a result of that, there were some people who were converted to Christianity. They professed to be followers of Jesus, but they weren't fully converted. They continued to hold on to their belief of endless suffering of many people beyond death. But an awful lot of those early Christians were fully converted. They did believe in Universalism. Of course, we can't go back and poll the people to determine what the percentage was, but it seems that it was at least the majority and probably the vast majority of the early Christians who believed in Universalism. Clement and Origen of Alexandria were two prominent theologians and leaders during the time of the early church who taught Universalism. Others included Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, and many, many others as well. As I said, there were some followers of Jesus who weren't fully converted. Tertullian was one example of that. He became a Christian at age 40, and he held on to his belief of endless suffering of many people beyond death. In fact, Tertullian so relished the idea of other people going to hell. Of course, it was always other people, never himself. But he so relished the idea of other people going to hell, he said he believed that one of the best things about heaven would be the superb view of the damned frying in hell. Now, doesn't the thought of that just make you feel good all over? Isn't that awful? A person, how could a person who was a follower of Jesus, a follower of the one who taught so much about love and peace and compassion and forgiveness and so on, how could a person like that so relish the idea of so many people suffering excruciating torment in hell forever? The theologian Augustine was another example of a person who wasn't fully converted. He became a Christian at age 32 and also held on to his belief of endless suffering of many people beyond death. But Augustine was a pretty decent theologian in some respects, or many respects actually, and therefore it's not surprising that his theology started to become dominant in the church. He lived in the latter part of the 4th century and into the 5th century, and so it's not surprising that by the 6th century there was coming to be quite a controversy over the issue of universalism. In order to resolve this controversy, the Roman Emperor Justinian called a church meeting. It was the 5th Ecumenical Council in the year 553. Now, does it seem a little strange to you that a Roman emperor would call a church meeting? Well, it makes perfect sense when you think about the fact that emperors like to control people. Isn't that a given? Emperors like to control people, and they had learned that threatening people with eternal damnation was a foolproof means of controlling them. You see, if you can convince people that spending eternity in hell is a real possibility, you've got them where you want them. You can get them to do anything you want by threatening them with eternal damnation. That probably sounds familiar to you, because there's still many, many churches today that seek to control their members as well as others by threatening them with eternal damnation. Okay, but the emperor and the hellraisers of the day, the people who advocated the teaching of unending suffering of people in hell, they were having trouble controlling those free-spirited universalists. They could threaten them with unending hell all they wanted, and they didn't take it seriously. So the emperor allied himself with the hellraisers, and together they pushed through a resolution which abolished the teaching of universalism. Now, of course, it's not surprising that with all the power of the church and the state against the teaching of universalism pretty well died out or went dormant or underground after that. And that lasted for a long time, for like about 1,000 years. But you can't suppress the truth indefinitely, right? Eventually it'll start bubbling up someplace. And that's what happened about 300 years ago. It really started more than 300 years ago, but it was about 300 years ago that the growth in people accepting the teaching of universalism started to become a strong movement once again. John Wesley, who was the primary organizer and leader of the Methodist movement back in the 18th century, he had a close association with a group of Christians called the Moravians. Now, the Moravians were universalists. They believed in universal salvation. Isn't that a wonderful thing? But anyway, in those early years, Wesley used to argue strenuously with them. He believed they were so wrong. But Wesley continued his lifelong association with the Moravians, and it seems that they eventually wore him down, because Wesley eventually came to believe in universalism late in his life. Now, I love to tell United Methodists that Wesley eventually came to believe in universalism, and that's because in the United Methodist Church, the most conservative people are the ones who are most likely to reject the teaching of universalism. At the same time, they can often be heard to say, let's go back and reestablish the teachings of John Wesley. And I say, yeah, let's do that, because he eventually came to believe in universalism. The American colonies proved to be a particularly fertile ground for the spread of the teaching of universalism. George de Benneville came over from France in 1741. He was a physician, and he did quite a bit to spread the teaching in eastern Pennsylvania and New Jersey and in Maryland. John Murray came over from England in 1770, and he worked closely with the Quakers and the Baptists, which is a little strange. It sounds, I suppose, to work with the Baptists, in spreading the teaching of Universalism, because things have changed, unfortunately, today with most of the Baptists. Anyway, he worked closely with the Quakers and the Baptists in spreading the teaching of Universalism throughout the American colonies. It was under Murray's leadership that the Universalist Church in America was organized. As in the time of the early church, this modern version of the Universalist Church had many strong women leaders, and that was pretty remarkable. And one example of these women leaders was Olympia Brown. She was the first woman to be ordained by any denomination, and that when she was ordained by the Universalist Church in 1863. Now, when I learned that we Methodists started ordaining women in 1956, I thought that was pretty good, considering there's some churches that still don't ordain women, which is pretty astonishing. But at least I felt pretty good, though, until I learned that the Universalists beat us by almost 100 years when Olympia Brown was ordained by the Universalist in 1863. Hosea Beaulieu was the most prominent leader in the Universalist Church during his life and ministry. When he died in 1852, the Universalist Church had about 800,000 members. So it was a strong movement, to be sure. The teaching of Universalism hasn't been espoused only by Universalists or Unitarians, for that matter, but has been espoused by other leaders and theologians of other denominations as well. For example, back in the 19th century, there was a German theologian named Friedrich Schleiermacher. I wonder how many people here have heard of old Friedrich?
Yeah.
Okay, that puts you at definitely an above-average congregation. I saw at least 3 hands, and that puts you well above average, because Schleiermacher is not a very well-known theologian, right, but he was a fine theologian and a strong advocate of Universalism. Besides that, I'd just like to say his name. Friedrich Schleiermacher. I love that name. I think that name ought to be the envy of the civilized world, to have a name like that. Anyway, in the 20th century, there were some other prominent theologians who taught Universalism. Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Leslie Weatherhead, and many others as well. So the teaching of Universalism, I should get my water, I suppose. I'm feeling a little bit...
Step off the cord.
You did it.
There we go.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
I stepped on the switch.
That's our trick.
Okay, where was I? Oh, yes. Anyway, you might wonder why this is such an important issue for me as a United Methodist minister. Unfortunately, the teaching of Universalism is not something that we officially espouse in the Universalist Church. Actually, or in the United Methodist Church, actually, we have one of our doctrines of religion. We supposedly are not a doctrinal church where we have to buy into a certain set of beliefs. But in our book of discipline, we have articles of religion. And one of these articles of religion makes it real clear. Some go to heaven, others go to hell, and that's what it's going to be for eternity. So while we're not really required to believe it, that's usually considered the official doctrine of our church. But anyway, so why would I, as a United Methodist, travel around speaking on Universalism? Well, it seems to me that the teaching of a God of eternal damnation has prevailed for far too long in most churches and in our society at large, and with devastating consequences. One of the reasons this is so important to me is because the teaching of a God of eternal damnation turns many people away from God. People know that they would never ever even consider punishing their own children excessively, let alone without end. Indeed, it is literally an insane concept to do so. You see, if anybody punishes their own children excessively and to extreme ends for a long period of time, or maybe even for a short period of time, what happens to them? They're either put in jail or prison or a mental hospital. Yet that's what people say God will do with people for eternity. Torture them forever because they were naughty. That's literally an insane concept. But that's what a lot of people believe about God. So the teaching of a God of eternal damnation turns many people away from God because they just can't relate to that idea of a God, of a monster God. And so they seem to just reject the idea of a God of eternal damnation. And so it causes people to turn away from God. Sometimes they become atheists. Now, I need to acknowledge that I've learned a lot about atheism from UUs, and I'm grateful. When we went on the road in 2003, I knew a little bit about atheism, but I didn't know very much. But as a result of speaking in UU churches, I've met a lot of wonderful atheists. I didn't expect that. I expected atheists to be really sad people, but I was so wrong. That wasn't the case at all. And so one of the high points of traveling around the country speaking is that I've met a lot of wonderful atheists in UU churches. I've met a lot of wonderful people of a great variety of faiths in UU churches. But I found that for some of them, they find atheism to be a thoughtful, responsible, mature way to approach life, and it works for them. For people for whom atheism works, I really don't have a difficulty. But for people in other denominations, when they become atheists, it often is not such a positive thing. And that is because in some cases they still have in the back of their mind the possibility of spending eternity in hell. And if there's no God to rescue them from that plight, then they sometimes conclude that they are doomed, and that can lead to despair and meaninglessness. In a lot of churches, many of their members attend church only at Christmas and Easter, and there's a good reason for that. That is because Christmas and Easter are 2 times a celebration, and on those 2 occasions, there's little danger that anyone is going to bring up that awful teaching of a God of eternal damnation. So it's not because people are too lazy to get up and go to church the rest of the year. It's out of self-preservation. They've heard more damnation teaching than they care to hear about, and they're not going to put up with any more. And so they stay away from church except for Christmas and Easter, those 2 times of celebration when there's little danger anybody's going to talk about the God of eternal damnation. And then there's, in our country, pretty nearly half of the people who don't go to church even at Christmas and Easter. I've spoken with an awful lot of unchurched people, and they so often bring up the idea of the unending suffering of people in hell, that it obviously is an issue that weighs heavily upon them. They seem to instinctively reject this idea and hope that somebody will tell them that it ain't so. They seem to want to make a rebuttal against the teaching of a monster God who throws people into hell kicking and screaming against their will to torture them forever because they were naughty. They also seem to instinctively reject the idea of a God who isn't very powerful or very caring, and who allows people to just go through life and somehow of their own free will find themselves experiencing hell, and then just to abandon them there. So what kind of a God is that? A monster God who tortures people forever? Or a weak and a not very caring God who either can't save everyone or who doesn't want to save everyone? So there are people that are not aware that there are progressive and open-minded churches among the United Methodists and Presbyterians and Lutherans and Episcopalians and so on, as well as UU churches, of course. They're not aware that there are churches that teach love instead of judgment, that teach hope instead of damnation. And so they drop out of church altogether. We all want to make the world a better place. And this is what motivates me more than anything else to travel around the country speaking on universalism. We all want to make the world a better place, but we're not likely to accomplish very much in this regard as long as the teaching of a God of eternal damnation continues to prevail in most churches and in our society at large. That is because people's perception of God has a powerful and direct influence on how they live their lives. And so if people believe that God is judgmental and condemning and cruel, it's very, very easy to justify living that same way themselves. It's like the old song, "One Tin Soldier" goes, "Go ahead and hate your neighbor. Go ahead and cheat a friend. Do it in the name of heaven. You can justify it in the end." Sadly, I see people in our own country and around the world every day seeking to justify evil behavior in the name of heaven, in the name of God. And it's much easier to do that if you believe that God is judgmental and condemning and cruel. On the other hand, if you believe that God is loving and kind and merciful and gracious and patient and so on, then it's much more likely that we will live according to those standards. I believe this is of enormous significance. I think if we're going to change the world for the better, perhaps the most important single thing that we need to do is to change people's perception of God. There's a man named Robert Short who wrote a book called Something to Believe In. And in that book he says that people tend to resemble the gods they serve. I think that's profound. People tend to resemble the gods they serve. In other words, our perception of God has a direct influence on how we live our lives. And so it's very difficult to raise people's behavior above their perception of God. So what we need to do is to change people's understanding of God from judgmental and cruel to that of loving. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was sometimes criticized because he loved his enemies too much. He was told, "You shouldn't love your enemies, you should seek to destroy them." To which Lincoln replied, "Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" Is that powerful? Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends? Abraham Lincoln was a Universalist. He rejected the teaching of a God of eternal damnation. He believed in the power of love and the preciousness of each person, and believing that everyone would eventually experience fullness of life or salvation. And because of that, he could love even his enemies. And what a difference that made in how he lived his life. Seems to me that we who believe in universalism are called to live the same way. And so we're called to rise above being judgmental and cruel, to be able to transform the world through love. So, we who believe in universalism have a powerful and a wonderful message to share with the world. And it's really important that we share it. Again, Robert Short says, "There is too much at stake for us to allow ourselves to be intimidated by the wrathful self-righteousness of the hell-raising gloomy doomies." Isn't that a mouthful? There is too much at stake for us to allow ourselves to be intimidated by the wrathful self-righteousness of the hell-raising gloomy doomies. And then he goes on to say, "Therefore, our witness to them should be just as aggressive and unambiguous as theirs has been to us." Fundamentalists can be intimidating, can't they? They go around quoting the Bible and asking people whether or not they're saved. They exhibit such confidence, so they can be intimidating. But I say, let's not be intimidated by them. After all, we are the ones with the good news. They, in contrast, spread a teaching that is divisive and leads to cruel and inhumane behavior and justifies abuse. With their understanding, it is really no big deal to torture people, whether at Guantanamo Bay or whatever. Besides, they believe and teach that God fashioned hell specifically for the purpose of torturing naughty people forever. And if it's okay for God to torture people, surely it must be okay for us to do it. Besides that, the torture that we might inflict upon others, whether it's waterboarding or whatever, is nothing compared to the torture that they say that God will inflict upon naughty people forever in a literal lake of fire, no less. So we who believe in love, who believe in universalism, who believe in the preciousness of each individual, have a wonderful message to share with the world. So it's important that we not be intimidated by the hellraisers. The teaching of a God of eternal damnation leads to wars and racism and oppression and abuse, while the spread of the teaching of universalism leads to equality, respect, love, and dignity for all. So I say, let's not be intimidated. Instead, let us freely and boldly proclaim to the world the wonderful message of universalism, and the world will be infinitely better off because of it. Amen.